Welcome back, friends, to the story of Edgar Sawtelle. And we're more than halfway through the book. I'd love to get it finished before the end of the year so we can definitely start something new for the new year. So let's jump right in. We are actually on page 301. The chapter is called Popcorn Corners. The next day, Edgar set out again for Popcorn Corners, this time alone by bicycle. Anything to get away from the house while Claude was there, and he was there all the time now. Edgar slipped the picture of Claude and Forte into his back pocket and pedaled away to the north, retracing the route he and Claude had traveled along that thin gray gravel line cut through the Chequamegon. I hope I'm saying that. If I'm not, somebody write it phonetically in the comments. The Chequamegon forest. A county gravel truck roared past, drawing a tawny billow in its wake. The air was still thick with dust when he came to the blacktop and turned onto a small forest road. He passed marshes boiling with frogs and snakes, and later a turtle, plodding between the ditches like a living hubcap, its beaked mouth open and panting. A stop sign appeared in the distance, and when he reached it, he surveyed the entirety of Popcorn Corners, a tavern, a grocery, 3 equally decrepit houses, a band of feral chickens that lived in the culverts. He coasted past the tavern, which sported a ham's beer sign, lit to show the bear fishing in a shimmering land of sky-blue waters, and he halted in front of the grocery store, covered with white clapboards that hung slightly off parallel, as if covering some profound skew of the building's timbers. A pair of colossal ash trees cast their shadows across the storefront, and a single antiquated gas pump tilted among the weeds off to the side. The small parking lot was empty. He lowered his bicycle to the ground and pulled the screen door through its quarter circle in the dirt. Up front, behind a long grooved wooden counter, sat Ida Payne, the hawk-nosed, far-sighted proprietor of the store. Stacks of cigarette cartons filled the shelves behind her, red and white Lucky Stripes, Aqua Newports, desert-colored Camels. From somewhere, a radio droned out the news from the AM station in Ashland. Edgar raised a hand in greeting, and Ida returned the gesture in silence. He and Ida had a long, though stilted, acquaintance. He could remember his father carrying him into the store when he was barely a toddler, though Ida had never yet said a word to Edgar. He never tired of looking at her. He liked especially to watch her hands as she rang up purchases. They moved with an agile independence that made him think of tiny hairless monkeys. Her right hand slid dry goods down the counter while her left hand danced across the keys of an ancient adding machine, and Ida, unblinking, looked her customers up and down, her pupils magnified to the size of quarters through dish-lensed spectacles. After each entry, her left hand slammed the adding machine lever down, hard enough to stamp the numerals into a piece of oak. The locals were inured to all this, but strangers sometimes lost their wits. "That's it?" she would ask them, when she'd totaled their items, cocking her head and fixing them with a stare. "Anything else?" The veiny digits of her left hand punched the keys of the adding machine and leapt onto the lever. Thump. The thump really startled them, or maybe it was the head cock. You could see people stop to think, was that really it? The question began to reverberate in their minds, a metaphysical conundrum. Wasn't there something else? They began to wonder if this could possibly be their final purchase. 4 cans of beans and franks, a bag of old Dutch potato chips, and a half a dozen bobbers. Was that it? Wasn't there something else they ought to get? And for that matter, had they ever accomplished anything of significance in their entire lives? No! They'd gulp, peering into Ida's depthless black pupils. That's all. Or sometimes, pack of Luckies? This last was issued as a question, as if they had begun to suspect that an incorrect answer would get them flung into a chasm. Cigarettes often came to their minds, partly because Ida herself smoked like a fiend, a white curl always streaming from her mouth to rise and merge with the great galaxy of smoke wreathing over her head. But mainly, when the uninitiated stood before Ida Payne, they found themselves thinking that the future was preordained, so why not take up cigarettes? When something Ida didn't know the price of landed on her counter, her right hand would pick it up and twirl it until she spied the white sticker with its purple numerals, and then she would glance at a yellowing index card taped to the counter and say, without emotion, on sale today. She never declared the price. Edgar listened for these asides. On the drive home, he liked to match the stickers with the numbers on the adding machine tape that came with their purchases. Sometimes the numbers all added up. More often, everything was scrambled. He had once gone through the exercise of totaling up the stickers himself, though none of the individual numbers was correct. The total had been exactly right. He walked along the farthest aisle, past the canned milk and SpaghettiOs and the cereal. There was nothing he wanted, really, and he didn't have much money, but he dawdled. The plate glass window facing the road admitted less light than a person would have guessed, and the gloom only increased farther back. He half expected to find spiders spinning webs in the darker recesses. But that was the thing with the Popcorn Corners grocery. At first glance, it seemed disheveled and broken down, but when you looked closer, you found clean and neat. The rear of the store was a butcher shop, the domain of Ida's gaunt, aproned, white-hatted husband. When Edgar was little, he had entertained the notion that Ida's husband lived behind the meat case, among the grinders and cutters and the scent of chilled blood and flesh. Bottles kept catching his eye, especially smaller bottles. He picked up a bottle of fingernail polish remover and carried it for a while. He knew of only 2 uses for it. The second was to kill butterflies, an act he'd seen performed but he had never done himself. The idea reminded him of Claude and Eppie and the Prestone. He picked up bottles of saccharin, bottles of syrup, bottles of corn oil, and hefted them and set them down again. At last he returned to the front counter. Ida stood with her back turned, twisting the radio's antenna as the speaker hissed and crackled. Then she turned and centered him in her black pupils. Her left hand groped toward the adding machine, paused over the keys, and withdrew. He expected her to ask her question, but all she said was, "Nickel for the bottle." He dropped a quarter and a nickel into her palm. She stopped cold for a moment, blinked, and then turned and dropped the coins into the cash drawer. Outside, he lifted a bottle of Coca-Cola from the red cooler and pried off the top using the zinc buck tooth of the opener and watched the soda fizz. Clouds had appeared in the blue sky during his ride, and now they'd begun to turn dark. The breeze carried with it a vestige of spring chill. The window sash by the cash register slid up. Ida Payne's face appeared gray behind the screen. "You miss your daddy?" "He was a good man. He came in about a week before, and I got a feeling then. Nothing certain. Happens all the time. Someone hands across cornflake soup, nothing. Then they'll hand over something little, some little thing, and I'll get a jolt off it. It's so loaded up. It's not a message. People would tell you it's a message, but they're wrong. What it is, you pay attention to it long enough, you can start to read it. Read the juice." Through the screen, he could make out the shape of her face, the glint of her glasses, the stream of smoke fluttering up from her nostrils. "Some juice feels good," she said. "Some juice feels bad." He nodded. There was hot and cold lightning. "What can you do?" she said. "No one knows when something like that's going to happen. Weight of a coin can make all the difference. Man came in once, told me how he'd nearly died except for the change in his pocket. Change I'd made for him the day before. Something about that dime being just the right size to turn a screw, and without it, he'd have been lost." She didn't expect a response. He knew that. He stood waiting for her to go on and thought about all the times he'd watched Ida Payne's left hand hop over the keys of her adding machine. "When your daddy came in that last time, he bought milk and eggs, that's all. I rung up the milk same as any day, but the eggs, there was so much juice in 'em, it was like a hand grabbed me when I touched them. I dropped the whole carton on the floor. He went back and got himself another one. I was half afraid to ring it up. And I had this powerful feeling, almost never happens, that I should charge your daddy more for those eggs. Not less, more, you see. But I can't do that. People get mad. But your daddy, he looked at me and he said, 'Here's for both.' I should have taken the money. That would have been the right thing to do, but I said no. It was me that dropped them, and I wouldn't charge for both. And that time, the total rang up $2 even Steven." She was silent for a long time. Even Stephen, she repeated. That was the last time I saw him. I should have come, but I couldn't. To the funeral, I mean. Then she tipped her head and looked at Edgar one-eyed, a primeval bird in its cage. Child, she said from the gloom, come in here and show me what it is you brought with you. He almost didn't go back in. He stood and looked at his bicycle and then at the clapboard siding with its crazy paint and thought how, though every individual board looked straight and square, when you took them all together, something was cockeyed. But in the end, he pulled open the screen door and walked to the counter. From his back pocket, he drew out the photograph of Claude and Forte and set it on the scored wood between them. Ida's right hand scrambled across the counter and lifted it up for her to see. That one hasn't been here for a long time, she said. She looked from the photograph to Edgar and back again. I remember him, though. Those dog fights. Her left hand placed a nickel on the counter. Take your deposit, she said. He reached out and set the empty Coke bottle on the counter. Before he could let go of it, Ida's adding machine had sprung forward. His fingers encircled his wrist with a surprising might and pinned his hand hard against the counter. At once his fingers cramped closed around the fluted bottle. Then, before he quite understood what was happening, Ida's other hand had pressed the photograph of Claude and Forte against his free palm, and she had somehow curled his fingers closed and locked the hands shut as well. Then she leaned over the counter toward him. You think you can find that bottle? She said. You need to look for that bottle, because unless you can lay hands on it, you need to go. You understand me? You need to go. That's what's in the juice. He didn't understand her, not in the least. Her face was dreadfully close to his, and her fingers were squeezing his fist until the crushed photograph bit into his palm. The smoke above her head crawled in knots and ropes. Images he didn't understand occupied his mind's eye. A dark cobbled alleyway, a dog limping through the rain, an elderly Oriental man holding a slender length of cane with a great delicacy. Edgar looked at the Coke bottle in his rigor-locked hand, and Ida's monkey fingers encasing his wrist like a hot iron manacle, and then he saw that the bottle had changed. It had taken the shape of an antique cruet or inkwell, maybe a prescription bottle from olden days. Some oily liquid glazed the inside. Prismatic, clear, viscous. The thing was banded with a ribbon, and the ribbon was covered with markings in some foreign alphabet. And if you go, she whispered, don't you come back. Not for nothing. Don't you let the wind change your mind. It's just wind. That's all. Then she cocked her head and looked at him. She blinked. He recognized in her then a wizened version of the little girl with Shirley Temple curls, the one who had confronted him in the Mellon diner and asked for the secrets he didn't know. My grandma likes me. Want to know what my grandma says? A slab of a hand appeared on Ida Payne's shoulder, carrying with it the odor of blood and flesh. Then the butcher stood behind the old woman, his white apron smeared with sausage-sized lines of red. Ida, the man said. Ida! It's just wind, she repeated. It means nothing. Her fingers uncurled from his wrist. Instantly, Edgar felt his grip relax, and the bottle was simply a Coke bottle again, and not the odd-looking vessel they grappled over. Ida snatched it and slumped onto her stool, chin on her chest, drawing great, deep breaths. Smoke issued lazily from her nostrils. When her eyes, magnified through the lenses of her glasses, went momentarily pink, he saw the doll-like face of the little girl again. She says that before you were born, God told you a secret, but he didn't want anyone else to know. The butcher lifted the Coke bottle from Ida's grip and clomped to the rear of the store. There was a clink as he racked them empty. For some time, Edgar stood rooted to the unvarnished floor of the Popcorn Corners grocery, while the radio hissed out pork futures. The next thing he knew, he was pedaling like a maniac over the gravel of Town Line Road, halfway home. Forewarned was not forearmed. The catastrophe, when it came, turned on a vanity of Edgar so broad and innocent that he would look back on the events of that afternoon and find blame only in himself. He had nearly arrived home, pedaling the upslope on the last small hill before their field opened greenly to the west, when the shakes came over him, first in his hands, then his shoulders and chest, until he thought he would either be sick or jerk the handlebar sideways and pitch onto the gravel. He ground the coaster brake under his heel and stumbled away to sit in the weeds beside the road. Whatever had happened under Ida Payne's grip had been frightening enough, but worse, it had brought on a sudden, suffocating desire to recall his father's memories, those memories he had held so briefly. He closed his eyes, pressed his palms to his head. He heard the hiss of rain striking the new grass, and he felt the thousand soft impressions of it falling coldly on his skin. He remembered his father's hands passing into his chest, the sensation of his beating heart cradled, the images seething through him, the dogfights, the desire to stand between Claude and the world. A whole history he couldn't know, but their substance was again lost to him, as fugitive as the shape of a candle's flame. I have to go back, he thought. She can help me remember. She knows something about Claude. What had she said about dogfights? And who was the old man he'd seen in the alleyway? What was he holding? But he thought of how Ida looked afterwards, slumped on her chair like the empty shell of an old woman, and he wondered if she would even remember talking to him. If he asked her about the old man in the alley, he felt sure she wouldn't know what he was talking about. And anyway, he didn't have the courage to face her again. Not for a long time, maybe not ever. When he remembered the photograph, he clapped his shirt pocket. Empty. Sweat broke out across his forehead, and at first he thought he had left it at the grocery. If so, he'd have to go back. He lay in the grass and frantically searched his pant pockets until he found it, bent in half and roughly jammed in the back right. The photograph was in bad shape after being crushed in his convulsed fist under Ida's fingers. The emulsion was shot through by white cracks half a dozen ways. He pressed it flat. It puckered into meaningless geometric bas relief, dividing the image into triangles and trapezoids. But Claude and Forte were still unmistakably the subjects. Edgar propped his arm on his knee and held the photograph out and looked at it. When his hand stopped quaking, he remounted the bicycle. He topped the hill and coasted up their driveway. It was mid-afternoon. The Impala was parked behind the tractor, and Edgar's mother was crossing from the barn to the house with a set of training notes in hand. As he rode past, she called him, "Edgar, could you unload the truck?" "I was at the feed mill yesterday." He walked the bike into the milk house, wishing he could have gotten home unseen, to go somewhere with Almondine and think before he had to face his mother with Claude. At least his mother had been preoccupied by the time he shut the milk house door. She had disappeared into the house. He turned the corner into the barn to get the wheelbarrow, and as he passed the workshop, he glanced through the doorway out of habit. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He didn't even know anyone was there. Claude stood before the workbench, bent over something small, perhaps a jammed spring latch for a lead, tinkering with it like a watchmaker. Almondine lay on the floor, hips tilted, peering up at Claude, relaxed and complacent, her mouth hanging open in a quiet pant. A wedge of light streamed from the high workshop window. Motes of straw dust hung suspended in the air. Everything there was lit in degrees of light and shadow. Claude's shoulders and head, the chaff on his shoes, the saws and hammers hanging from the pegboard, the out-scooped curve of Almondine's chest, the contour of her head and ears, the scythe of her tail trailing along the dusty floor. Almondine turned to look at Edgar, sleepy-eyed and relaxed, and then back at Claude. All of this was framed in the doorway like some sort of painting, but it was the accident of a moment, something unpracticed and undesigned, and to Edgar's eye, beautiful. His breath stopped as if he had the wind knocked out of him. Suddenly, nothing at all about the situation seemed tolerable. He saw with absolute clarity that he had lulled himself into acquiescence and complicity. By now, some last thing gave way inside him. Something with no name. Perhaps it could be called the hope of redemption. For him, for Claude, for all of them. When it was gone, he felt that he had become someone else, and that the Edgar who had split away that first morning after the rain had at last returned, and in that new state, as that new person, he believed Almondine had acted unforgivably. her pose so lovely and serene, completing that homely tableau, as if Claude belonged right where he stood, when in fact he belonged anywhere else, in jail or worse. He managed to keep walking. He grabbed the wheelbarrow from the far side of the barn and hurled it before him alongside the aisle and onto the driveway. Then Almondine trotted up beside him. He flung the handles forward and turned and raised his hand above his head to down her. She looked at him for a moment, then dropped to the ground. He turned and kicked the wheelbarrow ahead, runners raking clouds of dust from the driveway. Almondine broke and came forward, and this time he whirled and lifted her by the ruff until her front feet came off the ground, and he shook her and shook her and shook her. Then he let go and downed her again and turned away. He loaded the heavy sacks of quicklime into the wheelbarrow and piled the bags of food on top crosswise. And he walked around to the handles and backed the wheelbarrow away from the truck. He meant simply to walk away without another word to her, but at the last minute he turned and knelt, his arms and shoulders trembling so violently he almost lost his balance. "I'm sorry," he signed. "I'm sorry, but you have to stay. Stay." He rolled the overloaded wheelbarrow in the driveway, staggering. And when he tried to turn it toward the barn, the thing tipped and the feed bags spilled onto the ground. One of them split and its contents poured out, and he kicked it over and over until kibble was spread out in a brown swath across the ground. He reached down and threw fistfuls towards the woods until he couldn't breathe. And after a while, he righted the wheelbarrow and loaded all the bags of food that had not split into the wheelbarrow's bed and bore it heavily forward. He emerged from the barn with a rake clattering inside. He made a pile of the loose food, shoveled it into the wheelbarrow with his hands. It took a long time. Spots danced before his eyes as if he had stared into the sun. Almondine was holding her downstay behind the truck when he walked out of the barn. He passed her on his way to the house, stride halting and overbalanced as though his spine had fused into a column of stone, and then he threw his hands into the sign for a release. At the porch steps, he turned back. Almondine stood in the sun, panting and looking at him, tail uncurled behind her. "Go away," he signed. "Release. Go away. Get away." And before she could move, he walked up the porch steps and into the house. The Texan. The insomnia that night was beyond anything Edgar had experienced. A goblin presence in his room, goading in between self-recrimination one minute and white anger the next. The sight of Almondine lying at Claude's feet like an idiot puppy had wounded something in Edgar so close to his center, so bright, so painful, he couldn't bear to look at it. He sat flinging out arguments, rebuttals, accusations, his heart firing like a piston in his chest, his thoughts whirling like flies around some phosphorescent that's a big word, phosphorescent blaze. He should have acted that morning, so long ago, the moment he'd understood what Claude had done. The hammer had been in his hand. Instead, he faltered and doubted, and the flame in him had choked to embers. But one breath of pure air had drawn it up again. That had been Almondine. None of it was her fault, he knew, and yet he couldn't forgive that. When his mother saw how he'd been treating Almondine late in the evening, she dropped any pretense of patience. He would stop immediately, and while he was at it, she said, he was going to rejoin the household and quit the nonsense about sleeping in the kennel. He had stormed upstairs and slammed the door and stood swaying with rage and confusion. The red rays of sunrise were coating the woods before he at last fell into an exhausted slumber. But it was no rest and no balm. When the sound of his mother working a pair of dogs in the yard woke him, it was almost a relief. He sat on the bed and looked at the closed bedroom door. He couldn't recall a morning in his life when he hadn't opened his eyes to the sight of Almondine. When they were younger, she'd stood beside his bed and nosed the tender part of his foot to wake him up. Later, she'd slept beside him, raising while he stretched and yawned. Even if she'd gone downstairs to greet the early risers, no matter how quietly he walked to the stairwell, she was there waiting, front feet on the bottom tread, peering up at him. He pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, and he could hear the scrabble of her nails on the hallway floor. When he turned the knob and swung the door back, she pretended it was a surprise, and she bucked in place and landed with her front feet spread wide, head lowered, ears twisted back. And he meant to forgive her, but at the sight of her, playful and coy, all his arguments from the past night possessed him again. How she pondered, how she was so much like another person he could name that she ought to go find her instead. Or even him, since she didn't care who gave her the attention she craved. She danced along beside him, catching the cuffs of his jean. It took her a minute to follow him down the varnished stairs, the headlong plunge of her youth replaced by cautious navigation. But she darted past as he crossed the living room and whirled to face him, making a little yowl and play, bowing again. He signed it down and stepped over her. 2 empty coffee cups sat at the kitchen table, the chairs pulled out to hold invisible occupants. He swabbed out a cup from the sink and poured himself the dregs from the coffee pot. It tasted like, I'm sorry, I'm already crying, thinking about how Almondine must feel. We like to think they understand what's going on with us, and she's just trying to get that relationship back. It tasted like acid on his tongue. He swallowed once and flung the rest down the drain. His mother was working the 2 dogs to be placed that day, Singer and Indigo. She would, he knew, be in a terrible mood. On the morning of placements, all she talked about were the qualities that made the dogs unprepared to leave. Edgar knew the litany by heart. All that time spent building their confidence, all that work teaching them a language in which questions could be asked and answered, all of it about to be abandoned and lost. His father had always been more circumspect about placement, but then he had surrendered the pups once already to training. He was also the one who managed the carefully scheduled mail and telephone correspondence with new owners to keep track of the dogs, so in a sense he never lost them. Edgar's mother, on the other hand, would storm around the house, indignant as the idiocy of owners, their laziness, their lack of compassion, flinging papers, slamming doors. The irony was, a person wouldn't have known any of that from watching her as she worked the dogs, not even on the day they were placed, because with the dogs she became a different woman, almost a character she played, the trainer, who was interested only in what the dogs were doing at that moment. The trainer showed no anger when dogs were unruly. The trainer gave instant, forceful guidance. As their time for placement approached, the only difference the dogs might notice was that they got less attention. If they were a bit lonely, it helped them bond with their new owners. Edgar didn't attempt to help his mother. He did morning chores, then pulled tinder and bamboo and drilled them on close work, heels, stays, leash tangles, and the things they had been practicing in secret, the tag, the drop, the carrying of small items in their mouths. Claude was bottle feeding one of the new pups. When he came out of the whelping room, Edgar took the dogs into the field, and Almondine placed herself along his route whenever he went. If he was behind the barn, she lay near the silo. If he was at the barn, she waited in the shade of the eaves to meet his glance. Each time he refused her. Finally, she lost heart and found a place to sleep. It took a long time for that to happen, but he saw the moment she finally turned away, and he let her go. Just before dinner, Dr. Papineau parked to sit down on the grass behind the impala. Edgar watched from the barn as the old man clapped a hand on Claude's shoulder, and they walked into the house. Shortly, an unfamiliar pickup slowed to a stop in their driveway and turned and trundled past the house. It was a big truck with an elaborate topper and Texas license plates. His mother and Claude and Dr. Papineau walked out of the house with Almondine trailing. There was something about watching Almondine from the barn, 30 yards distant, and something in her carriage, tentative and almost frail, that finally made Edgar understand how cruel it had been. He'd made a promise in his mind to make things up to her that night, that there was nothing he could do just then. Events required him to stay where he was for a little while longer. Claude walked around to the driver's window and gestured at the turnaround. The pickup backed up and stopped again, facing the road. Then the door opened and a man stepped out. There was a short conversation. Almondine greeted the visitor along with the rest of them. Then Edgar's mother looked over and called, "Edgar, would you bring out Singer and Indigo?" This was the start of the presentation, in which he had always played a very specific role. When he had been little, it had especially impressed new owners to see a child, hardly taller than the dogs, lead them out of the kennel. Now that he was older, the presentation was less dramatic, but the stagey element remained. After the new owner arrived, after introductions and talk, Edgar emerged with the dog, or dogs in this case, not uncommon. since they placed many pairs. His father had loved the little choreographed drama of it. After all, it said owners meet their dogs just once. Why not make sure they remember it? It was a small, extra guarantee that dogs would be treated right. Sometimes the owners gasped when Edgar and the dogs appeared. He'd even seen his mother smile, despite her dire predictions, as he measured out steps along the drive, affecting a relaxed, nothing out of the ordinary expression. The dogs, excited by a stranger's arrival, raced one another along the lengths of their pens, pushing out through the canvas flaps to get a look, and turning and pushing back again. Edgar quieted them and walked to the pen and held the two dogs to be placed. Singer was a gloss russet male with an imposing stance but an easy-going demeanor. Indigo was petite for a Sawtelle dog and as black as if dipped in ink, except for a blaze of cream on her chest and another swirl across her hips. Edgar drew the slicker brush from his back pocket and went over to them one last time. Indigo's coat was fine and luxurious when brushed up. The dog stomped in the straw and panted under his brush. Singer protested the delay with a deep moan. "Hold on," he sighed. "You'll know soon enough." He stroked their faces and squatted in front of them. He made them look at him steadily, and he put his hands on their chests, seeking the spot that would calm them. Then he put collars on them and brought them into a heel, one on each side, hands on their withers, and they walked up the barn aisle. When they stepped outside, the knot of people by the house shifted. The talking ceased. Edgar paused for a moment with the old gooseneck light fixture overhead. His father had often joked about hearing angels sing when he and the dogs turned that corner. "Oh my," he heard the man say. When they were halfway up the drive, Edgar patted each dog lightly on the shoulders. They turned to look at him. He flicked out a release as they arrowed forward, all silken motion, feet thumping softly on the ground as they ran. Then there was chaos and introductions. The new owner was a slight man, leanly built, with brown hair and jug ears and a thick mustache. His accent matched his license plate, a heavy drawl. He knew dogs. He presented the back of his hand rather than his fingers. His touch was confident and slow. Occasionally the dogs might be skittish with the new owner, but not this man and these dogs. "They sure do look at you, don't they?" he said. Edgar's mother and Claude explained about the gaze exercises, and then they introduced Edgar. The man's name was Benson. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Benson," shaking his hand. They let Mr. Benson get a good look at the dogs, see their structure. Edgar ran them through recalls to get them moving. Mr. Benson knew what to look for. He checked their stipples and hocks, and he commented on their gait. By the time they had finished, the sun was almost set, and they walked to the house together, the dogs surging ahead to wait by the door. "Son," Mr. Benson said, "you've got the touch with these dogs, even more so than your mama." He turned to Trudy. "No offense, ma'am. I mean that is the highest compliment. I have never seen like the way they do for him." "None taken," she said. Edgar could see she was reluctantly charmed by the man and proud of the dog's behavior, which had been flawless. "Edgar makes it look effortless." "It's not even so much efforts," Mr. Benson said. "It's something else. I don't have a name. They just want to work for him." Edgar's mother laughed. "Don't be too impressed. They're on their best behavior tonight. We'll go over things more thoroughly tomorrow. Indigo had a couple of bad habits you should know about, but they're good dogs." "Well, I'm daunted by the prospect of living up to what these dogs have been used to," Mr. Benson said. "I'm not ashamed to admit it. I wonder why they listen to a dope like me after working with y'all." They downed the two dogs along with Almondine in the living room and sat down to dinner. Mr. Benson said he lived in the hill country near San Antonio. He wondered if they had ever been there, and they said no, and he told them all about it. The live oaks and the pecan trees and the wild mistletoe in the river. They asked about his trip. The drive had been long, he said, but he loved the open highway, that stretch of asphalt opening out before him. Edgar sat and listened. Mr. Benson had taken a room at Fisher Paradise south of town. He was staying for several days. He liked to talk, almost a match for Dr. Papineau, but his thoughts ran to philosophy and religion. "Tell you something I think is curious," he said. "In the Bible there's hardly no mention of dogs. What there is makes them out like vermin. I can't make sense of that, can you?" "Sure," Edgar's mother said. "Back in those times, for every dog that lived with people, a dozen more ate garbage and ran through the streets. Companion dogs were the exception. The man nodded and looked at all of them. Edgar got the impression he had raised this question before at other tables. Give not that which is holy to the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before the swine. That's Matthew. It's always bothered me. I'm a heathen nowadays, though. People in my congregation fall faint if I walk in on a Sunday, but a lot of them aren't as holy as a good dog. Dr. Papineau was inspired to contemplate the population of dogs on the Ark, and from there the conversation turned back to Singer and Indigo. Edgar's mood had lightened briefly when he worked the dogs, but as Claude began explaining the history of the kennel, it turned wretched again. Mr. Benson didn't question Claude's authority, though to Edgar, every word he spoke marked him as an impostor. Now Claude was explaining about Buddy and the blood tie between the Sawtelle dogs and the Fortunate Fields breeding program. That surprised Edgar. He thought what he'd learned through the letters was a secret or forgotten, but it wasn't. And there was no reason Claude wouldn't know. Now he was explaining how many dogs they had placed each season and how the breeding program established by Edgar's grandfather worked, how half the dogs they placed went to families who had already owned a Sawtelle dog, how the majority of breeding dogs were fostered by farm families nearby. And as Edgar sat and listened to Claude, he wondered why he hadn't plunged the Impala into the trees when it had the chance. When they finished dinner, his mother brought out Dr. Papineau's cheesecake and poured coffee. Mr. Benson commented on the cheesecake, and Dr. Papineau chimed in with his shop-worn joke. Something about it made Edgar angry. Whenever he looked at Dr. Papineau, he saw that fatherly hand laid on Claude's shoulder, and he thought the old man was a fool to let himself be manipulated so transparently. Even the new owner had begun to bother Edgar. Most wanted to get away from the table as soon as possible to release their dogs from their stays and touch them, but Mr. Benson seemed oddly incurious. The dogs were patiently holding stays. Singer was even dozing. But anyone could see they were waiting to spring up and investigate the man all over again. Then Mr. Benson turned to Claude. Now I've got something to ask you, and you should just say no if I've overstepped. Of course, we'll get to this tomorrow when we work through the branch contract and pick out stock, but I'd be obliged if I might have a look at your kennel. That's a fine barn. I haven't seen many like it since I passed Colleen, and I want to see for myself what sort of magic happens there. Claude and Dr. Papineau were looking at the man with equally self-satisfied expressions, and Edgar turned to his mother. What is he talking about? She waved him off with a small gesture. He signed again. Why is he talking about a branch contract? She turned to him, her expression calm, but beneath that flushed with anger. Not now, she signed. You haven't wanted to talk for weeks. We'll discuss it later. What does he mean, selecting stock and breeding stock? Not now. Mr. Benson was watching the exchange, and he leaned back. I don't mean to be rude. It was just itching at me. Maybe that's for tomorrow. Not at all, Claude said. I'll have to tell you, though. There's nothing magic to be found out there. Just slow, steady work. Claude led Mr. Benson outside, followed by Edgar's mother and Dr. Papineau. Singer and Indigo lopped ahead. Edgar stood on the porch, and he recalled that game of canasta they'd played the autumn before. You can get anything you want in this world if you're willing to go slow enough. Claude had said it. At that time, Edgar had taken it as a beer-fueled backwoods munificence, but now he heard it as a perverse taunt. When did you start wanting this so badly, he wondered, watching Claude walk alongside the stranger, explaining what they did as something to be replicated, capitalized, multiplied. Was it one of those afternoons you spent on the barn roof watching this all? Were you surprised at what your brother had accomplished after you left? Or have you been thinking of this for longer than that? How slow have you been willing to go? From out in the yard, Mr. Benson's voice rose in reply to some questions Claude had asked. I have good news for you there, he said. I talked with the son, James, the night before I left. He's very excited about this idea, calls it a unique opportunity. He keeps saying over and over, a Carruthers dog, a milestone in catalog merchandising. The first time a breed has ever been brand named. Says he's got a mock-up of the Christmas wish book on his desk. Pups on the inside of the front cover and everything. Of course, they're the wrong kind of pups right now, but they can fix that picture in one day flat. Almondine walked up behind Edgar and stood at the threshold of the kitchen door. He wanted to make amends with her all evening, but now he was seething again, and in his mind he saw her lying in the workshop, light streaming over her like some kind of painting, and Claude at work. He swung the kitchen door shut and made sure the latch caught. He trotted after the others. The long twilight had faded, and a fitful wind shook the maple. To the west, the canopy of the forest shivered against the darkening rise of blue. "I forget sometimes what it's like to be this far from city light," Mr. Benson was saying. "Our night sky is never this black with San Antone so close. Do you ever see the northern lights?" But before anyone could respond to the man's question, something curious happened. A gust of wind passed through the yard, carrying with it a sheet of warm rain, translucent and swift. The drops pelted the roofs of the vehicles and splashed thinly across them all. The dogs snapped at the air. Dust rose from the driveway. Then the rain was gone, returned to the night. Everyone looked up. There was nothing overhead but a field of stars. "That don't surprise me," Mr. Benson said. "That happens back home. Rain'll fall smack out of a clear sky. That rain could have been in the air in North Dakota and only now touched ground." They'd come to a stop in front of the barn near the leaden pock of quicklime, where the grass had once turned white. The man squatted down to stroke Indigo's chest. It was the first time he'd touched either of the dogs since dinner, and when he stood again, he produced a handkerchief from his pocket and wrung his hands in the cloth and pulled it along each finger. "It occurs to me every once in a while that it's raining somewhere, even when the sky is clear. There's more water in the air than we're apt to think. You took all that water out of there, there'd be a flood that only Noah would recognize. When I can't make sense of things, I try to think big enough to see rain falling somewhere. Water's always moving. That's the view I try to get. If it's not falling, it's coming up through the ground, getting ready to fall again. That comforts me. Can't say why. Sometimes I only need to get above the treetops. Late afternoons where I live, you can see half a dozen big old bull thunderstorms coming along. Shafts of light between them and rain trailing underneath like a jellyfish. Sometimes I have to go up high enough to see most of the whole country. Way, way out to California before I see rain and clear sky both. That's all in my mind, of course, but no matter where I am, if I can get to where I see it raining and where it's clear, that's when I can do my most powerful thinking." Then Mr. Benson caught himself. "Good God," he said, "I didn't realize how long I've been sitting alone in a truck." Edgar's mother laughed and they walked into the kennel. None of them seemed to take more note of the rain, though to Edgar it had felt like a hand brushing his face. For a moment he was unable to move. When he caught up, the dogs began to bark. His mother hushed them, a small thing that impressed the man greatly. Mr. Benson started asking questions. How long did they let the pups nurse? Did they believe in docking dew claws at birth? Why did they use sawdust instead of straw? And so on. Claude took down the master litter book and pulled a file at random and talked about the breeding research and the log sheets and the scoring, all with great authority, like a man describing furniture. Edgar's mother led Mr. Benson up to the mow and showed him the fly lines, the floor rings, and all the rest. "Where does this young man come in?" Mr. Benson said when they came down again. "He earns his meals, I'm sure." "Well, for one thing, Edgar names the pups," his mother said, "and he's in charge of grooming, and this year he's training his first litter. I expect they'll be ready by fall." Mr. Benson asked to see Edgar's litter, and Claude set his hand on Edgar's shoulder and told him to bring them out. Until that moment, Edgar hadn't decided to have his litter play out what they'd practiced. He'd always imagined some circumstance with just him and the dogs and Claude. But now he saw it didn't matter who else was there. There was no choice anyway. He had to have an answer. He couldn't stand the knowing and not knowing, the residue of memory without the memory itself, the coming apart every time he sat across from the table from Claude. All he needed was one unguarded moment, like the one when Claude first spotted him watching from the apple tree. An expression had flashed across Claude's face then, shock or guilt or fear, but whichever, it had vanished before Edgar had understood what it might reveal. This time he'd be ready. He would see it for what it was, and if he saw guilt, he would not be stopped by anyone's touch, not his mother's, not Almondine's. He would not sink to his knees, shaking like a newborn calf. "Let's proof them on stays while we're at it," his mother said. He nodded. He walked past the pens and into the medicine room, where he yanked open the drawer reserved for Dr. Papnow's supplies and stuffed 6 syringes into the breast pocket of his shirt. It looked strange, he knew, and he tried to act nonchalant as he walked out again. He brought out Opal and Umbra and stayed them in the aisle. Then Pout, Baboo, Tinder, Finch, and finally Essay. The 7 of them sat, twitchy and excited, 40 feet down the aisle from his mother and Mr. Benson and Claude. "This'll just take a moment," his mother said, and she shot Edgar a quizzical look and kept talking. "We try to use every opportunity to train them, and when a stranger visits, the dogs naturally want to investigate. A lot of our training is just finding ways to test their skills in new situations, like holding a stay when there's a distraction. Here, Edgar, send one of them over. First tell them the dogs see everything that happens here," he signed. "What?" "Just say it. Say they see everything and they never forget. You'll understand in a minute." He stood and waited. He thought his mother might ignore his request, but she turned to Mr. Benson and Claude and Dr. Papnow. "Edgar says to tell you that the dogs see," she faltered for a minute, then continued, "that they see everything that happens here, and they never forget." Edgar was standing before the dogs, looking down the line to make sure they didn't break. He touched Opal under the chin. She looked at him, he released her, and she dashed down the aisle to the 4 of them standing by the workshop. Then he pulled one of the syringes from his shirt pocket. His hand was shaking, and as the syringe came out, it snagged another, which went clattering to the floor. He snatched it up and placed it in Baboo's mouth. "Tag," he signed, then he turned to watch. Baboo trotted down the aisle with the syringe in his mouth. Edgar kept his eyes on Claude, who had caught sight of the syringe. When Baboo reached them, he pressed his nose into Opal's hip, and Opal looked toward Edgar. He gave a small gesture with his right hand, and she dropped to the floor and lay on her side. "Well, I'll be," Mr. Benson said. He stooped to stroke Baboo's muzzle and came away with the syringe in his palm. "What's this?" he said, and he held the syringe in the light. Before anyone could answer, Edgar sent Pout, and Pout tagged Baboo, and Baboo went down. Mr. Benson reached over and extracted the 2nd syringe from Pout's mouth. "This is part of their training to carry medicine?" Seeing the expression on Claude's face, Edgar began trembling so violently he had to kneel. Finch went next. He tagged Pout. Pout looked at Edgar, hesitated, and dropped. Then it was Umbra's turn, and Tinder's. Each time there was a syringe and a tag on the hip, and the dog went down. "Well, I'll be," Mr. Benson. "It's almost like as if... Do they think?" Claude stood watching it all. He glanced at the open door, then back at the dogs, then at Edgar. Edgar didn't expect the last part to work. It was different from the rest, something he had worked out with Essay alone. He put the remaining syringe in her mouth, and he signaled her down the aisle. When she reached Tinder, the only dog standing, she turned to look back at him. "Left," he signed. Essay veered around Tinder. The barrel of the syringe was sideways in her mouth. She walked up to Claude. The safety sheath was on the needle, but when she pressed the blunt, soft tip of her nose into the muscle of Claude's leg, he flinched as if he'd been stung. Edgar was walking down the aisle, neither blinking nor averting his gaze. "Drop it," Claude said. "Drop it!" He looked again toward the Dutch doors and then faced into the workshop, and then got control of himself and took a breath, looking steadily at Edgar. A muscle under his left eye was jerking. "What the hell, anyway?" he said, and stalked out of the barn. Edgar began turning in the aisle, performing a weird, exhilarated dance. He signed a broad